I have one question, and I defy anyone in my audience to answer it. The allegation is from our government that Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate and he is a repressive dictator that uses the military to intimidate and arrest anyone who speaks against him. Where was that today? Or I should say yesterday, since it's technically 12:40 in the morning right now. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the streets. It's a country of 30 million people, so I wouldn't take much from that. But other than a few cases of police, not military, shooting tear gas, which would have happened here in this country, where are the mass arrests? Where are the tanks? Where are the grenades and the opening fire on the innocent crowds, as was alleged by our government? You didn't see it, did you? You saw protests. You saw counter-protests. You saw some things get out of hand, and police had to keep just like they would here. But the day came, the day went, a psychopath decided to stand up and inaugurate himself as interim president, Juan Guaidó. And I want you to think critically about the amount of narcissism it would take for any human being to stand up and swear themselves in and name themselves interim president of a country, never having stood for an election. Not one Venezuelan has ever cast a vote for Juan Guaidó as president of anything. And oddly enough here, on his left hand, he has the correct number of people he has to thank for anyone knowing who he even is. Those 5 people being Ambassador John Bolton, Senator Marco Rubio, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, our Vice President and President respectively. Those are the 5 people responsible for Juan Guaidó. Not one Venezuelan has stood up, put his name on a ballot and said, I want him to be president. He inaugurated himself today. No court did. No legislative body did. This is what's happening. And there was a conspicuous absence of anything the U.S. has alleged about the Maduro regime at all. And you can read article after article after article attempting to use psychological operations techniques to make you believe one thing when right before your eyes, the very opposite was true. And here's where the U.S. completely loses credibility. U.S. weighs oil sanctions on Venezuela as it steps up pressure. Wait a minute. Why would there still be sanctions? Why? Apparently your guy's in charge now. He's your dude. Why wouldn't you be lifting the sanctions? Why wouldn't you be canceling the illegal Obama executive order that came down in 2015 declaring Venezuela an existential threat to the United States, or some such language like that? Extraordinary, I'm sorry, not existential. Extraordinary threat to the United States. Why wouldn't that be lifted immediately? Good old boy, random guy named Juan's in charge now. He inaugurated himself. The U.S. recognizes him. The diplomats that have been asked to leave by the actual government of Venezuela have been ordered to stay by our government. And a month ago, nobody knew who this guy was. No one had any idea who Juan Guaidó was. It's alleged that he was a child during the massive mudslides that killed so many thousands of people back in '98, which would be about right for his age. I wish he would do a little bit more study into that history and realize why so many people died in those mudslides. Because it happened before Chavez took power. In fact, it happened literally right as the reason Venezuela was so poor at that time before Chavez took power. Why so many people were living in shanty towns on the sides of mountains so that when the rain hit, it washed them all away. He survived that. I wish he would look into history and understand why that happened in the first place. What happened during the 90s to cause Venezuela to fall from one of the wealthier countries in South America to one of the poorer, even though their oil production went through the roof. It literally is Bizarro world right now. Half of the world recognizes a man who won 2 elections, Nicolas Maduro, and was appointed to run by a man who won 4 elections. But the U.S. calls that illegitimate, and this guy who just stands up at a rally and says, "I'm president now," that is what the U.S. recognizes as legitimate. We are now run by criminals in this country. I'll say this again, I would fight and die for my neighbors. Whether they voted for the current administration or not, they're my neighbors. But as far as that little pseudo-state up in Washington, D.C., no, they need to go away because they have now bankrupted our country. They have closed down our government. They're arguing about whether our administrator is going to give a speech inside one building or another, and meanwhile they are trying to overthrow illegally the government of another country. And that is what the facts are on the ground right now. There has, and I'll say it again, there has never been an election where a Venezuelan has cast one vote for Juan Guaidó for anything. The legislative body of which he believes he's in charge was made illegal by the Supreme Court of Venezuela, and even within their own little rules, only they named him, there was no vote. They talk about the isolation of Nicolas Maduro. Yeah, I suppose if you don't count Russia, China, Turkey, Mexico, Greece, Spain, and half a dozen other countries, India. I think it really does boil down to the fact that the military of that country has decided to stand fast. And oddly enough, out of all of the paragraphs and paragraphs and pages and pages and pages singing the praises of Juan Guaidó, when the actual truth comes out, here, they give it 3 sentences. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Petrino said via Twitter on Wednesday that the country's armed forces disavow any president who is self-proclaimed or imposed by dark interests. This came hours after opposition leader Juan Guaidó swore himself in as president in a challenge to President Maduro. Swore himself in. That should tell you everything you need to know. I think what we're going to do now is I'm just going to recognize Pluto as the closest planet to the sun. I am going to recognize Jupiter as the smallest planet in the solar system. And Earth as the warmest. There. We're just gonna say that's the truth now because we just recognize it to be that way. It is absolutely insane. Here's another great question. Why didn't the United States, with this whole hiccup in Korea, why didn't they just say, you know what, we're going to recognize Moon Jae-in as the president of Korea. There's no more North Korea, no more South Korea. We're just going to call it Korea, and we're going to recognize the president of South Korea as the president of the whole country, and we're going to pretend that Kim Jong-un doesn't exist. And that his government in Pyongyang is illegal and irrelevant, and we are going to just go forward that way. Why didn't the United States do that? Because they knew that most of the world would laugh at them. And that's what's going to happen now, unfortunately. Sadly enough, this guy has exactly the amount of chance on his right hand of actually governing. Even if somehow he were to make his way into Miraflores Palace, this man has absolutely zero clue how to govern, which is exactly what the U.S. wants, so they can step in and govern for him. And tell him exactly what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. The man has no governmental experience whatsoever, which is irrelevant because he's never been voted for. This is a sea change moment in the United States, and no one is seeing it. We have now become the thing we feared most. We are far more corrupt now than the crown in England ever was, or in Spain, by our actions today. And by Nicolas Maduro's actions today, he proved that he actually is the leader of that country. Because having control of the military, having control of the police forces, having the ability to take it personally and use them to quash all of this, he doesn't. That's how a leader who is comfortable as a leader acts. There weren't tanks rolling through the streets. There weren't mass slaughter and mass arrests. This man still walks about free, this Juan Guaidó. So tell me, where is the horrible dictatorial state? Where's the evidence of that? We don't see it, do we? All we saw today were a bunch of people walking around, protesting, and the one thing I will leave you with is this. Where were these protests 2 months ago? Where were they 6 months ago? If there were truly this many people organically against the government in Caracas of Nicolas Maduro, why did they wait until today? Why did they wait until after the inauguration of Nicolas Maduro for his second term? You see, that's the question they don't want anybody asking, because what the U.S. is going to allege is that they don't recognize the last election result, but they did the one before. And if they say that, then somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute, United States, why do you recognize the 2013 results and not the 2018 results? And then the U.S. would have to squirm. And they couldn't explain that. But of course, because most media only targets 30 to 45 seconds of anyone's attention span, that's what ends this. So I will leave it there. This is a situation that's going to be changing on the ground, literally day to day. But do understand, the U.S. was proven completely and totally wrong today. And they know it. Like, share, subscribe.